Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update, second part thereof for the 22nd of July 2025. Quite a bit to talk about in this video, some of which I discussed in my live stream yesterday, but I'll revisit it now. It was in my military aid video and I had a question that was pertained to some of what we're going to talk about. Anyway, start with some really good news. Google has announced yesterday that they have removed nearly 11,000 YouTube channels and other accounts tied to state-linked propaganda campaigns from China, Russia, and more in the second quarter of 2025. That's according to CNBC. The takedown included more than 7,700 YouTube channels linked to China. These campaigns primarily shared content in Chinese and English that promoted China, supported Xi Jinping, and commented on US foreign affairs. Over 2,000 removed channels were linked to Russia. The content was in multiple languages that supported Russia and criticized Ukraine, NATO, and the West. This is great, as someone says below, great but not good, good but not good enough. You need this on Twitter, on X. Elon Musk is being absolutely in dereliction of his duties, I would argue, especially when he came into owning Twitter, almost not owning it because he was complaining that there were as many as 5% of the accounts not being real. And Dorsey, said that they were working on that, but that was where it's at. And Musk said that, well, that's not good enough. Bought it anyway. He was forced to buy it, actually, because he was going to pull out. And there was a clause saying he couldn't do that. And then he subsequently allowed those to flourish, those bot and troll accounts. That needs to happen at Twitter. It needs to happen at TikTok. It has been happening at TikTok to some degree. It needs to happen more. And it needs to happen across all of the social media platforms. But good on Google for doing something there. Let's hope it's the beginning of a larger attack on... This isn't about freedom of speech, right? So when you have state actors controlling these entities, you remember Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat, what he has said about having, state actors and state proxies and then grifters, essentially, and then you have the true believers in the middle that are manipulated by all these three. Not only is this grifting, it is also a case of state actors and people aligned with state actors who are kind of like state actors who are proxies. When they are doing this purposefully to disinform, that's not freedom of speech. That's not a true believer saying, hey, look, I really believe this and here it is. This is like, I know this is false. I am putting this out here in order to disinform the general public, and I'm doing it for the benefit of a particular state. That is warfare, right? That is actual information warfare, and that needs to be stamped out. I couldn't give a toss whether you think, oh, it's an assault on free speech. Don't care one iota. This is an assault on us. This is a defense against being attacked by China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. We need to do something about it. So that is good news there. Okay. Now, Italy has cancelled Putin ally conductor called Valery Gergiev. This has been ongoing for a couple of weeks. Anton Gerashenko has been campaigning on this. A concert at the UNESCO World Heritage Site was planned, would have been his, I think, first concert since the beginning of the war, and it has caused a lot of controversy, and it's actually finally been cancelled. Art is free, but propaganda is something else. Kind of like what free speech is great, but propaganda is something else. It would have been his first Western show since the Ukrainian invasion. We need to stop these pro-Russian people, anti-Ukrainian people from spreading their influence around, and they can do that through art, believe you me. Now, Ukraine has nationalized its way out of a crisis. Now it can't stop making money, is the Euromaidan Press article here. An interesting one, lots to talk about here. I've just highlighted a few bits. Okay. From market reform to wartime statism, despite the fate of Privatbank before Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine has been moving slowly but steadily toward a leaner government. Some of the old Soviet-style giants had been cut down to size. The farmland market had opened. Selling minority stakes in key state-owned firms was on the table. By the third quarter of 2024, the National Bank of Ukraine reported that state-owned banks control 53% of all banking assets and held over 60% of all retail deposits. Government spending has grown dramatically too. Ukraine's Finance Ministry announced the 2025 state budget allocates 26.3% of GDP to defense and security. The state now controls not only banking and defense production, but also energy and much of the digital economy. It's easy to see why survival trumps ideology, but without a clear plan for scaling back later, this state-heavy approach could become a problem in itself. Okay, so the idea is that throughout the course of this war, the state has had to, for the survival of the nation, get involved in more and more stuff, and that means that the state owns lots of things. But then what happens after the war is over? You know, how do you try and stimulate the free market to be more responsible for economic and I guess social activity in Ukraine? So Ukraine's banks have earned nearly 6 billion euros since the start of the full-scale war. Ukraine Business News calculated in 2024 alone, Open Databot found banks had a record 2.5 billion euros in net profits, 20% more than in 2023. And paid 2 billion euros in taxes on those profits, almost twice as much as the year before. So actually, banks are making more money because there's all sorts of money going all over the shop, right? And that means they actually pay more taxes. So kind of there is a benefit to this. But there's a lot of state-owned banking going on. 7 state-owned banks made 1.6 billion euros, accounting for 65% of the sector's total profit. Yes, so part of this success comes from access to cheap international loans, and International Monetary Fund and others are involved in that. It talks about banking in a little bit more detail, and then also the energy sector, and then rebuilding the infrastructure. I'm just going to rejoin the article a little further down. Russian forces have destroyed 70% of Ukraine's available energy generation capacity since the start of the full-scale war, and the key to keeping the lights on lies in decentralization. Smaller distributed energy sources are harder to hit and easier to repair than large centralized power plants. Oh my goodness, I've been saying this for several years now, and I've been trying to say, look, it's not just because I'm environmentally minded and I really like renewables, right? But it's not that. It's to do with security and decentralization of the grid, so that you don't just have a whole couple of regions cut out because a thermal power plant's been blown up. A single energy entity that is a foundation of energy supply for huge areas is just an easy target for the Russians. You need to decentralize. You need hospitals to be able to be self-sufficient with their own generation, and schools and university or whatever. And well, actually industry. Now, industry is going to be generally needing a greater amount of energy. So that's a little bit harder. They're probably going to have to be drawing from the grid. But this article talks about this. And in fact, the next Euromaidan press article is about energy in Ukraine and how Ukraine is going green during the war. So why is the EU's program funding fossil fuels? But anyway, so that you got the tech sector in Ukraine is obviously incredibly important. And then you've had seizures from the government in terms of certain sectors, domains in Ukraine. That's going to be happening during war. But it's missing, as mentioned, an exit strategy. So all things considered, Ukraine's wartime economy has so far held up pretty well. Kyiv School of Economics forecasts GDP growth around 3% this year. Inflation dropped below 10% in early 2025, and the banking sector is stable and profitable. But, how do you get out of that? Talk about privatization. It's gone quiet. At the same time, Ukraine's international allies are growing impatient. The IMF warns that permanent state dominance is bad for competition. And this is all true, but the difficulty is trying to do that during war. There are ways forward, it says towards the end. One idea is to introduce sunset clauses, laws that would require the government to reduce its ownership in major companies to less than 25% within 5 years of the end of martial law, unless Parliament votes to delay. Another idea is to issue war bonds that could later be converted into shares in state firms. That would help prepare these companies for privatization by spreading ownership more broadly. Then, of course, you've got oligarchs. When you've got individual powerful people, that gets in the way of sometimes the best things taking place. Anyway, that's something to think about. I'm not really going into crazy depth for reasons of flow and whatnot, but I just want to go on then to Ukraine is going green during the war. Was the EU program funding fossil fuels Ukraine has been building wind farms and solar plants while dodging Russian missiles. Meanwhile, the EU's €50 billion program is it meant to help? It's funding more gas and diesel generators than renewable energy. So I've talked about this, about how, during the war that they need to decentralize, and they've been doing a pretty good job, it appears, of generating green energy during wartime. Ukraine Recovery Conference, it just took place in Italy, wrapped up in Rome last week with familiar promises: €2.3 billion in new agreements, including €265 million for energy security and green transition, and €500 million in guarantees and grants to help Ukraine's small businesses. But missing from the announcement was any mention of fixing the fundamental problems that keep Ukrainian communities locked out of the European Union's flagship funding tool, the Ukraine Facility. Let's be clear, this facility worth €50 billion is a significant commitment. Pillar 2, the part meant to help rebuild Ukraine's economy and support clean energy projects, has the potential to do real good, but right now it's still lagging behind. There's no data, transparency or investor confidence, but most importantly, there is no access for small or medium-sized businesses. So the money is there, but the results are harder to find. One result was a bank survey conducted by the National Bank of Ukraine with 20 banks that showed that Ukrainian banks have issued 3,500 loans worth of almost 17 billion hryvnias for energy projects. It seems like a lot. However, many of the energy projects supported so far rely on diesel or gas, hardly the clean energy transformation we've been promised. The numbers tell the story. While solar projects received funding for 102 megawatts, gas piston cogeneration units got 185 megawatts and diesel generators 102 megawatts. Ukrainian banks financed nearly 3 times more fossil fuel capacity than solar power. The scale of this shortfall becomes clear when you consider that Ukraine had what they had before the war, approximately 9.9 gigawatts of installed renewable energy capacity, including about 6 gigawatts from solar power alone. Ukraine's National Renewable Energy Action Plan aims for renewables to constitute 27% of electricity consumption by 2030, requiring a total installed capacity of 12.2 gigawatts of solar energy. Despite the ongoing war, Ukraine has commissioned around 660 megawatts of new renewable energy capacities during 2022 to 2023, encompassing solar, wind, biogas, and small hydroelectric plants. Wind and solar plants generated about 10% of Ukraine's electricity as of 2023, with a share of clean energy produced, including large hydropower plants, reaching 20.3%, or an increase from the pre-war period. In 2024, Ukrainian state banks approved loans for construction of 83 megawatts of solar power plants on the roofs of private households. So I think that's something that's really important, that kind of micro generation, which is an absolute record for the country since the implementation of such projects. I've got solar panels on my roof, and I have an electric car, just trying to put my money where my mouth is. And I absolutely love it. I've been obsessed. All my life, I've wanted solar panels ever since I was a kid and learning about photovoltaics. I was just really so into renewables. Why would you be burning up finite stuff that causes pollution? Yeah, I know that there are still issues with some of these chemicals and blah, 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 blah. But if you look at all the data is in on whether, what's environmentally better, and including electric cars. And I know some people pull out certain cherry pick data points, but honestly, it's just from an environmental point of view, the data's pretty much in. If you're going to get a new car, the best thing is obviously, don't build anything new, I guess. But when you're looking at, I've said this before, like Ukraine needs to think about what country it is after the end of this war. And they need to say, right, we have two things. We need to lean on where our expertise is in terms of what we have generated during this war that's of benefit to the rest of the world. Sadly, in a way, that's going to be war economy, that's going to be defense tech, right? But that is drone technology and drone skills and whatnot, so they can train and build stuff to do with war, right? So that's one thing. Tech is another thing that they're employing in a war context as well. And then you can have, war tech as well. So for example, we have their Delta system that they use, which is amazing, by all accounts, modular, and it allows them to see what's going on right across the battlefield in live. And you can add, put these bolt-ons and whatnot. They're trying to sell that to NATO nations as well at the moment. That's kind of the silver lining, is they should be able to generate some kind of decent economic output from those domains. And you've got the general tech area that Ukraine has long been known for. They're big on app development and all sorts. Then you've got this opportunity to just start again, right? So if you've been at war and you need to rebuild your society, economy and whatnot, and literally rebuild cities and towns, there's your opportunity to go, well, let's not just rebuild and replace what we had with exactly what was there. Let's start from scratch. Let's build sustainable settlements with, sustainable energy sources, because here's our opportunity to do so. It's easier to do it now when we've kind of got a clean slate than tack these things on and try and change things that are already there. And so I think Ukraine does have an opportunity going forward to be a very forward, and then what you want to do is say, and then we can become the green tech leaders, if you like. So not only are we already good at tech, but we can lead into green technology. Obama said this years back when he was president, and it got shot down because people think, oh, he's trying to be too woke, people on the right in the US, rather than saying, don't give a crap whether you think it's woke or liberal or whatever. It's about future proofing. Like, you want to jump in on what's going to be the future, and you want to back that to the hill because you want to be ahead of the curve. So what's happened is that's just allowed China to be now the biggest producer and installer of energy, and so they're of renewable energy. So they're way ahead of the United States, I think, in terms of tech and all sorts. More fool you for just still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. It's like, this isn't about environmentalism. This is about sensible economics and trade and whatever. Anyway, to continue here, it should be noted that before the full-scale invasion, only 0.98 gigawatts of grid-connected solar power plants had been built in Ukrainian households. So they've been doing a good job. Anyway, interesting article here. Goes on, Ukraine Energy is funding lacks basic transparency, so there needs to be better data, more transparency. It's not for a lack of interest. Ukrainian companies and communities are eager to get involved in rebuilding through clean energy and sustainable infrastructure, but the application process under Pillar 2, as mentioned, creates barriers that seems designed to exclude them, and it sort of gives you, it says what should be going on. We're going to leave it. I think this is a massive article, by the way, so I'm only looking at certain parts of this. So despite all of this, and against the backdrop of a devastating war, Ukraine is pushing forward with its clean energy revolution. Andrei Konechenkov, chairman of the board of the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association, recently announced that 7 new wind power plants are currently under construction in Ukraine, with a total capacity of 4 gigawatts of projects ready for implementation. Last month, international consulting company Boston Consulting Group predicted an increase in the share of renewable sources in the structure of Ukrainian electricity production from 15% 2022 to 28% until 2040, with the potential for further growth. Balint Silhavi, principal of the Boston Consulting Group, said, quote, "We expect that about 50% of new generation will be solar and wind power projects. This means the entire energy sector will become greener and greener." And my point being more decentralized and therefore more secure, arguably. Now, moving on. So you go and look at these articles if you want a full picture of what's happening. President Zelensky said that one of Rustem Umerov's key tasks as the newly appointed National Security Council Secretary is to help revitalize the negotiation process. He is also tasked with advancing weapons agreements, tracking implementation of NSDC decisions, and strengthening the tech-focused Stavka format. So where Jonathan Fink and myself were talking about this the other day, that, no, it wasn't, it was Rick the Ukrainian and myself, when we had a live stream together, that Rustem Umerov as a defense minister was just doing too much, going around the world trying to sort out defense procurement and stuff, but not looking after the defense forces and managing them in Ukraine. So now he seems to have a role that sits alongside really what was part of what he was doing before. And Denis Shmyhal, now coming in from Prime Minister, takes over the role of Defence Minister, but he might not do so much travelling around. He's actually going to manage the defence forces in Ukraine as the minister there, and so they can share that role because it is so important. I was saying to Rick, look, Rustem Umerov and Reznikov before him needed to be able to go and do this. I mean, that's kind of You need to go around and scrabble around the world to get everything you possibly can from all these different nations, whilst also needing to have a really safe pair of hands cradling the defense forces or supporting the defense forces in Ukraine. Okay, so moving on, not really rendering there. France. So a very meaningful hour-long conversation with the French President Macron said to Zelensky the other day. This is going back a few days. We discussed the situation on the front lines, strengthening Ukrainian air defense, in particular the supply of missiles for SAMP-T systems, Aster-30 missiles. There's a bit of a bottleneck there, and financing of interceptor drones. I think France and Italy really need to ramp up production of the SAMP-T air defense systems and their interceptor missiles so that they can compete with the Patriots. Europe really needs to focus on that. Now, quite a lot going on with France. Jean-Noël Barrot, the foreign minister, seems to be all over the shop at the moment, doing a good job, all over the shop in a good way. French Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, came to Kyiv for a 2-day visit. After arriving, he immediately headed to the sites hit during the massive overnight attack on Lukyanivka district the other night. So he's around and making these connections. There is now news that France will be co-producing drones inside Ukraine, and possibly Renault, that might come from them, or they might also be producing drones back in France. So that's really good news. Now, let's go to Germany and a bit of UK. So Ukraine is unlikely to become an EU member by 2034, said Friedrich Merz. Lots of people are hoping by 2030. I've said previously that 2030 would be really charitable. It's a difficult thing to join the EU. You have to jump through a lot of hoops and it takes time. And we're already in 2025, looking towards 2026, right? So the Chancellor believes that as long as Ukraine is under attack, EU accession is impossible in any case. Quote, for us, the highest priority is to do everything possible to end this war. Then we will talk about the restoration of Ukraine. I think that's broadly fair to say. Russia intensifies espionage in Germany, according to NTV. So according to observations by the Military Counterintelligence Service, Russia is intensifying its spying attempts and disruptive measures in Germany. Germany is at the moment very cognizant of the impact of Russia on its national security, but in terms of cyber warfare, information warfare, and actually like sabotage, outright sabotage. And they're being more and more vocal about it. That's why Friedrich Merz is so supportive of Ukraine, because he understands that Russia is the threat. It's a really good excerpt from the Kalen Robertson. In fact, I think I might play that to you. Let's finish this. So the Russian intelligence services are acting as we knew it during the Cold War. The number of suspected cases was practically doubled within a year. Russian agents continue to travel to Germany via third countries. So here it is. It's well worth watching all of this. Really good stuff from Kalen with Anne Applebaum. I'd love to get Anne Applebaum on and talk to her. Her book, Autocracy Inc. is very good. Here, talking about Friedrich Merz and the attack on Germany, I think hybrid warfare that is being waged on Germany by Russia and their recognition of the danger of that Russia poses is eloquently expressed here by Anne Applebaum. And I think she does give kudos enough to the Europeans to know that though they're behind the curve, they are recognizing that Russia really are the bad guys here. Now, certain nations, UK, Germany, I think France, I think obviously the Baltics and the Scandinavian states really are very aware of who the bad guys are here. And I love listening to this because it kind of validates so much of what we've been talking about here at ATP Geopolitics for so long.
Do you think that Western leaders understand the actual threat that this bloc faces to all of us, to democracy, to our institutions? Or do you think we're moving way too slowly? I mean, how far are we at understanding this?
I think some Western leaders understand some of it, and some are better than others. But as a whole, you have to say, the leaders of Europe are behind the curve. They're behind the curve in understanding how much Russia hates them and how much it's not just about Ukraine, it's about them. I mean, I think actually the war in Ukraine is mostly about them, in that it's mostly about Europe and wanting to undermine the power of Europe and the unity of Europe and the idea of Europe, which is still appealing to so many Russians.
Boom. That is entirely my thesis. That the biggest enemy of Russia is the EU. In fact, it's the enemy of China, I think Russia, and the Trump administration. I think they all want to undermine the EU because the EU unity presents a power bloc that is, for as far as Trump sees it, a competitor that he keeps calling nasty. So he doesn't like the EU. Russia doesn't like the EU because it's holding Russia to account and keeping them from becoming this overt imperialistic nation. And China have, their own power plays going on. This is what Anne Applebaum so eloquently expresses.
I think they fully understand that. Some understand the social media game better than others, but many don't understand it at all. And I think many have also underestimated the threat, not so much this is not from the US government, but the power of the American far right, which I think also is now aimed very much at Europe and European institutions as well, and including some European governments. And they've underestimated all of those threats. And they tend to imagine it's just about better messaging or something, where I think the arguments are more fundamental. If you look at US politics now, a lot of arguments aren't anymore about policy. And you can see some people in the political world still trying to make arguments about policy. Our policies are better than their policies, therefore we should win the election. And they haven't understood the degree to which debates have now shifted to culture war and identity, and that they need to, and that's partly under the influence of the Russians, who understood how powerful those things were. And that
we're going to return to that as well. Actually, I'm so glad I played this to you, because something perfectly encapsulates what Anne Applebaum just talked about. It's not about policy. It's about winning these arguments on culture and a sort of anti-woke ideology that seems to be more important than anything else, than your science budgets and your education budget. Well, science is you can't learn about climate change because that's woke, and you can't learn about this in education because that's woke, and you can't hire black people because that's woke, and you can't. It's so everything's being defined by these culture wars battles that the Russians are stoking. And Applebaum recognizes and say, Europe needs to really wake up to this. We all need to wake up to this. And actually, the American right, populist right, is, of course, it's awake to that because it's perpetuating that
they need to shift the way they argue. So I think they've not caught up yet to maybe just even to the scale of Russian and Chinese ambition.
Do you think we'll realize too late?
I hope not. There is a learning curve happening, and you can hear it. Even the current German chancellor talks very differently from the previous German chancellor. Actually, I think Keir Starmer probably understands a lot of these things better than he sometimes articulates. Macron is very changed from what he was, a few years back. So no, they are learning, and they are beginning to understand the threat. And you can point also to countries who have always understood it, like Sweden or Finland, or the Baltic states or Poland. So it's not hopeless, but there is something like a lack of ability to work together collectively. And that's, of course, not only on this issue, it's on many issues. That the Europeans as a group aren't yet able to articulate singular policies. I'm hoping that changes.
Yeah, and what does that look like?
And that's got to change. So much more to say, and there's some other little nuggets from that talk I'd love to share with you at another point. So going back to this European unity, New York Times reports, brothers in arms Macron, Merz and Starmer prepare Europe for a future without the US. Bilateral treaties have been signed. Cooperation on nuclear deterrence and assistance to Ukraine has been agreed. The EU is preparing an alternative that could replace American leadership. But of course, this depends on whether there's going to be a sweeping across Europe of right-wing populism that would undermine that Euroscepticism that we are seeing brewing up in Czechia, for example. And you've got Rassemblement National chomping at the bit, and AfD in Germany. This kind of unity is challenged from within Europe, which that sense of discontent is fermented by the Russians, of course. And then you have here a perfect example of this coming from Tucker Carlson, who is effectively being the mouthpiece of the Kremlin.
Running out of options in Russia, because the truth is, the Russian economy is not what we thought it was, and we were assured by some of the dumbest people on the planet who currently serve in the United States Senate that Russia was merely, and I'm quoting now, a gas station with nuclear weapons. They somehow kind of never built St. Petersburg, and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky didn't exist, and they were just this kind of desert nation with a lot of gas and weapons. I mean, it was absurd. Like
and of course, it's not absurd. I mean, it's very much like that to a large degree. When you look at, so he's been to St. Petersburg and Moscow and seen, oh, a wonderful metro station. Yeah. Have you been out east? Have you been to these vast areas that are completely under-supported, underfunded? It's you getting vast amounts of money coming in from these natural resources that, can fill the coffers of the sovereign wealth fund, but aren't going into the welfare system, aren't building up some kind of great culture across Russia. They're being focused in areas like a kind of representation of oligarchy itself, where the money is focused into these oligarchic entities, and then, focused in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and even then in certain areas of those. And it is quite empty and fragile, but to a degree. But of course, the sovereign wealth fund goes a long way, and there's a lot of gold and there's a lot of money in reserves. Now that has been eaten up for the last 3.5 years. So we are really at a stage where the Russian economy is particularly fragile right now, and all the indicators are pointing towards a potential disaster at some point, sooner rather than later, I would argue, but there still is some reserves left to eat through. But I think Tucker Carlson's understanding of Russia is just, oh look, wonderful Dostoevsky and all of these wonderful cultural icons represent a much richer Russia than is being portrayed. Well, actually, no, I would say that there is that, and there are some great cultural aspects, I'm sure, to Russia, but there's an awful lot of poverty and inequality and under funding and a lack of support for these regions that means that Russia is a country of many things, and it's not all what you think it is, Tucker Carlson, and you are just spouting Russian propaganda.
So we underestimated and frankly just didn't really understand the nature of the Russian economy, Russian civilization. And I'm not endorsing that economy or civilization. I'm just saying we didn't understand what it was. And so we levied these sanctions on, we cut them off, kick them out of SWIFT. And we, in the end, hurt ourselves more than we hurt Russia.
I want the data for that, because Russia is hurting. Like, look at all the data points that I'm sharing with the audience every day. So I just think Tucker Carlson's full of shit.
We sent a very clear signal to the rest of the world, and you guys are implicated in this also in Germany and in Europe more broadly, because the US dollar is relevant to you. We sent a very clear message to everybody: don't hold your assets in dollars because they can be used as a political weapon. It was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. If you want to hurt yourself, do that.
So this is obviously with the German media outlet Bild. He also says in an interview, your country, Germany, is going down. Russia is on the rise. I mean, I don't know how you could think Russia is on the rise. But anyway, you should be angry with your leaders. Instead, you're angry with Putin. Yeah. And this kind of goes back to Anne Applebaum and the American right that is kind of equally attacking, I think, Europe from the other direction. You got Russia on the one hand and Trump's MAGA America, MAGA republicanism on the other, or MAGA populism on the other hand. Anyway, going back to European unity, you got Friedrich Merz here and Keir Starmer talking. So, to my personal great and lasting regret, said Friedrich Merz, the United Kingdom left the European Union. The UK, France and Germany, again, these are the sorts of things that they're saying in these press conferences, but you're not hearing enough on BBC News and Sky News and across the socials, because this is uncomfortable for the wonderful reform, and because it's all about reform. They don't want to be hearing things like this. So, but anyway, this is what Friedrich Merz says: to my personal great and lasting regret, the United Kingdom left the European Union. The UK, France and Germany are moving closer in terms of security policy, migration policy, and also economic policy. We are also wanting to strengthen contacts between people, strengthen mobility between children, young people and students. Brexit has been particularly painful here, and this makes visits by school classes possible without complications, without passports and without visas. So, really looking to get closer to the UK to get closer to Europe, and that European unity to hold. But at the same time, when I talk about, reform, I mean, here's a great example.
Let's just get on.
Here's Nigel Farage, the great snake oil salesman, going to a pub and speaking to all sorts of different reform voters, and kind of this is what you're up against. This sense of rose-tinted nostalgia.
God's sake, let's just get on. I mean, we're British, we stood alone for years. Let's just do it. You know, I mean, I was watching a thing with the Queen. There's billions of people in the Empire. Let's get back to being the British Empire again. That's what it's all about, you know. It's about being the British Empire. Okay, thank you.
Did anybody here vote to remain?
No, you're not going to get any.
No, I'm sorry, I think you're in the wrong country.
Did everyone vote here remain? No, I think you're in the wrong country. We need to get back to being a British Empire. If you think that in this globalized society that we can be a British Empire again, I just don't know what planet you're on. It's like you need a sense of realism, but that isn't just underwriting this idea that, hey, you know, this is Britain for British people, and you know, we don't want to get closer to Europe, and that's just you'll be Little England on your own and suffering as a result. We're already suffering economically from Brexit, but that kind of thinking, I think, is counterproductive. But then, of course, we've got now right-wing riots going, or protests going on outside an immigration hotel that houses immigrants in Epping. You've got the riots that have just taken place, or I need to look into that. All sorts of sort of violence and whatnot going on in Spain as well. Immigration is still an issue, whether it's a perception over reality or whether that's reality. You know, immigration is a big issue for Europe that it needs to deal with, because reform and AFD and Rassemblement National will gain and gain and gain if immigration isn't solved in some substantive way. And that's the challenge for the Friedrich Merz's and the Keir Starmers and Emmanuel Macrons of the world. You know, you might have sensible centrism, centre-right governments, centre-left governments that are interested in, you know, governing purposefully for the people and improving, I don't know, you know, the welfare state or education or whatever, or you're going to get your populist extremists coming in and say, right, we're going to tear everything down because immigration. And this kind of culture war approach to politics is no better expressed than, honestly, if you want to go and be sick a number of times in your mouth, go and watch the Jubilee Surrounded. So there's this thing that happens, this setup called Jubilee, where they get 20 people and they surround one person. So it might be like an atheist with 20 Christians, or a right winger with 20 liberals, or whatever. And you kind of clock in, clock out, and you argue, and this person in the middle. So I think Ben Shapiro's done it from that right wing point of view. You've had a number of different people do this. And here you have Mehdi Hassan, who is your left wing liberal, pro Palestine. What else would he be? I guess pro-immigrant. He's a British person that is now a citizen of the United States, so on and so forth. So he was surrounded by not just 20 right-wing people, but 20 far-right people in the United States, right? Far-right Americans. And it was horrific. Like, some of the things these people said. My point of including this, it's so important to understand that the Overton window has shifted. The Overton window is the window of what's acceptable to talk about, right? It's like you got this thing that's acceptable to talk about, and it used to be that you could never talk about this kind of stuff over here. You could never admit to being anything like that, even if you felt it like deep down. If you admit it in public, that's the end of you. Like, so you just, there are certain things you just weren't normalized, right? Now it appears that everything is freaking normalized. So you can have people outright on television admitting to being a fascist and laughing about it. Hey, I am a fascist, right? And that seems to be all right. So this is just one example, and there are so many from this Mehdi Hassan. I feel so sorry for Mehdi Hassan, although he is brilliant at being able to cope with all of this stuff. But there are some horrific things said to him, like, you're not welcome here, go away, blah, blah, all that, the usual kind of stuff. That's all normalized. I'm like, just openly on TV. Like, I'm saying this to you knowing that this is going to go out to millions of people, and I don't care. And that's that kind of culture wars thing that has now morphed into a polarization whereby these polar extremes are normalized enough to be acceptable to express in public and be happy with it, right? Get a load of this. Now, due to the copyright infringement laws or the copyright laws in place and processes in place on YouTube, this particular video flagged up as an infringement and they didn't want me to play it, and it would take 30 days to challenge that so I could use it for fair use. I don't have that time. So Benny Pie has come to me with a solution where we're going to play an AI version of this exchange where the voices are not these guys' voices. I can't really play you the video. I do want you, I'm going to mute it and just show you this part towards the end where this man Connor is laughing, and you won't hear it on the AI clip, but he is laughing at being a fascist, and he admits to being a fascist, and then there are claps from people around him as he finds this sort of hilarious, where he kind of admits to I am yeah ha ha ha, and he's laughing and they're all clapping. They're clapping that he admits to being a fascist.
Just get my...
and it's pretty outrageous. So what we're going to do is I'm going to leave that on probably his laughing face, and I'm going to play you the audio of this now.
And if that autocrat kills you and your family, you're fine with that?
Well, I'm not going to be a part of the group that he kills, because that's the whole thing.
How do you know? Autocrats tend to kill everyone, including their own supporters.
Well, Carl Schmitt makes this point very well in his work. It's the friend-enemy distinction, right? You liberals called Schmitt the Nazi theoretician. Yeah, absolutely. I don't care.
Are you a fan of the Nazis?
I don't care. I frankly don't care being called a Nazi at all.
I didn't say that. It doesn't matter if I say that. I said, are you a fan of the Nazis?
Well, they persecuted the church a little bit. I'm not a fan of that, but...
What about the persecution of the Jews?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't support anyone's human dignity being assaulted. I'm a Catholic.
But you don't condemn Nazi persecution of the Jews?
I think that there was a little bit of persecution, which is bad, but...
We may have to rename this show because you're a little bit more than a far-right Republican.
Hey, what can I say?
I think you can say, I'm a fascist.
Yeah, I am. Absolutely.
I'm just checking who's clapping.
Just outrageous. I'm a fascist, and then they clap him. In other words, they agree because they're fascists too. Like, this is, hang on, where are we at where this is all normalized? Absolutely incredible. And as I say, I don't even think that was the worst one in there. There was some just horrific examples of just the normalization of these ideas. And he's like, even, to reference Carl Schmitt, like, I'm going, yeah, but that's not what this Nazi theoretician said. What? Anyway, he's now lost his job, apparently. So I guess maybe it's not so normalized that he can just get away with being like that. But he's come out and said, my name is Connor, and I was recently shown that in the latest Jubilee episode. As a result, unfortunately, I was subsequently released from my job. I'm raising money as an emergency fund and for other expenses while I look for a new job. And of course, he'll make loads of money out of this. To clarify, I was terminated from my position for holding fully legal, traditional right-wing political views. I don't know if they're traditional right-wing political views, unless you're in 1930s Germany. And even then, that wasn't that traditional. That was kind of new on the block. This is cancel culture and political discrimination on full display. I just went on the Rift where I shared my story of what happened, and you can watch it here, so on and so forth. Now, I don't know if that's cancel culture. Like, if you were working in a school, right, and you went into the staff room and someone came in and said that they were a big fan of, that came into the staff room and said, yeah, that they were really attracted to children. And you're like, okay. I mean, you'd expect that. Yeah, no, I don't think you're going to last too long in this job. There are times when, I don't want to work with you. You're a fascist. And I think espousing that kind of rhetoric around here is pretty dangerous. So, you can call it cancel culture. I just call it, not having douchebags to work with. Anyway, moving on. So the UK is obviously trying to be closer to Europe, and they've actually gone hard on supporting the 18th sanctions package that has been put together by the EU. So David Lamb, the Foreign Secretary, said the UK and our allies are striking at the heart of Russia's energy sector by lowering the oil price cap. This will directly hit Putin's most critical revenue stream and drain his war chest. We will keep up economic pressure as we stand by Ukraine. Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor, said, the Exchequer, the UK and the EU are turning the screw on the Kremlin's war chest by stemming the most valuable funding stream of its illegal war. This step will target Russia's oil revenues and ramp up the pressure on Putin by exploiting the biggest vulnerability while keeping energy markets stable. But meanwhile, Dmitry Medvedev in Russia, the former President, Prime Minister, one or two, commented on the new sanctions package. This is what Dmitry Medvedev said, and goodness me, I mean, he said plenty of stuff like this before, but he doesn't hold back when it comes to insulting Europeans or world leaders. It's just incredible. European morons have agreed on the 18th package of sanctions against our country. It makes no sense to write that it is capable of changing Russia's position exactly as much as the previous 17 managed. Our economy, of course, will withstand, and the rout of the Banderite regime will continue. Strikes against the objects of so-called Ukraine, so it doesn't even call it Ukraine, it's so-called Ukraine, including Kyiv, will be carried out with increasing force. It is necessary to promote a course towards maximum distancing from the EU and the most odious countries of the European Union, which now include not only miserable Balts, insolent Finns, underdeveloped Poles, and Britons overgrown with their own shit, but also Germany and France. Just imagine if Keir Starmer wrote something like this. Or a former kid, so like David Cameron wrote this, whose leaders are haunted by the laurels of the Third Reich and the Vichy regime. How this ends for Europe is known. We only need to preserve the memory of their vile Russophobia for as long as possible and learn to hate them as strongly as our ancestors could. Hate is the most important weapon that allows us to move most effectively towards the opposite, its opposite, love. Of course, so if we hate, we can effectively move towards love. Yeah, of course. Of course, in relation to those who deserve it. P.S. The disgusting old woman Ursula von der Leyen, announced an EU strike at the heart of the Russia's war machine. I'm not sure she understands where the heart is, but she seems to always think with one part of her body, the one she was involved with during her unsuccessful medical practice. Just outrageous slurs there on Ursula von der Leyen and all of Europe. Just incredible. That's Dmitry Medvedev. Just incredible stuff. Now, let's go on to some positive news. And this is a chap, well, one of the people here is Ed, who worked for Base UA. I've interviewed Anton for Base UA, Pierre Dupont. I've travelled around Ukraine twice with Pierre, who works off and on for Base UA when he's in Ukraine. Here's Ed, who in an evacuation attempt lost, unfortunately, multiple limbs, which is really, really sad. And here he is with Richard Branson in London. And what we need is more billionaires actually involved. Is that Usyk as well? Involved in, yeah, it is. So the boxer, this is just before he boxed his way to victory. We need more super rich and powerful people being pro-Ukraine, because I'm sick and tired of people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and David Sachs sounding off against Ukraine and for autocracy and for Russia. Anyway, Florence Nightingale's statue in London was transformed with a Ukrainian coloured prosthetic limb to honour war victims. The campaign led by Richard Branson, Alexander Usyk and Howard Buffett. So there is a rich and powerful person. Howard Buffett has applied in so much money to Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. Highlights the work of superhumans during superhumans helping rebuild lives in Ukraine. Good stuff there. Now, on the sporting front, talking about Usyk, let's move to fencing. The International Fencing Federation seeks to bring back athletes who support or take part in the killing of Ukrainians. Over 440 fencers signed a letter to the organisation urging it to reinstate strict background checks for Russian and Belarusian athletes. So good. I read that as those fencers saying, no, we're not happy. You need to reinstate strict rules against them rejoining. Viktor Orban slams the EU budget proposal, claiming up to 25% could go to Ukraine, a non-member. He warns This makes Ukraine's economy Europe's problem for decades, citing a recent case of forced conscription. He calls on Brussels to sanction Ukrainian commenters, saying the EU turns a blind eye to the abuses, whilst also saying that he hopes V4, the Visegrad 4, that's Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia and Poland, will be revived in a year, meaning he's banking on the Andrzej Babis winning in Czechia and the Polish government falling, so his liberal alliance can get back together. Meanwhile, polls show Orban will be voted out in 9 months. So, okay, I said this in the live stream at great length. I'll try and be as succinct as possible. You've got this. So to go back to right-wing populism, particularly, I could talk about left-wing populism in Europe, but it's just not relevant. Like, I know you might think I'm biased against the right, which to some degree I am because of my own political predilections, but the far left in Europe is essentially irrelevant. It's really not very relevant. So there's no point talking about it. Like, if they support Russia over Ukraine, then yeah, that's a problem, but they're not getting into power. Whereas the far right extremists are getting into power or are influencing power dynamics in Europe big time. Rassemblement National, AFD, Vox, Reform, Confederation in Poland. You've got obviously what's happened in Romania and Moldova recently. You've got Viktor Orban and Fidesz. You've got the coalition in Slovakia. So this is a real challenge. Now, I stated in the video the other day that actually when these guys get into power, they are so unserious about ruling that there is a chance they could only last one cycle, which I think is what would happen in the US with MAGA, right? And we're going to go on to this because actually you look at the polling of Trump at the moment and it is terrible. I mean, it's just objectively terrible. So the summer year one approval ratings, Kennedy 1961 from 75% right through Eisenhower, Bush, Carter, Obama, Reagan, Nixon, Bush, Biden, Clinton. And then you get to Trump 1, 42%, Trump 2, 38%, right? So he's got terrible approval ratings at the moment because it is populism that is unserious about the rest of what governance is all about, and he's about like burning everything to the ground, taking away welfare, trying to control the press, trying to control the judiciary, trying to etc. Now, I think there's a chance that when these people get in, the electorate realizes that they're not very good at doing the proper governance stuff, that actually when you listen to them and are attracted to them on their single issue stuff like immigration, yeah, okay, that might be a serious issue for you, but if that's all they've got and they've got nothing serious, or all the other stuff they're smuggling in behind immigration is terrible politically, then you vote them out again, right? Unless you do an Orban, which is you control the judiciary and you control the media, and that's what Trump is trying to do in the US at the moment, is control the media. I did a whole video on that about the payouts from Disney and Paramount and Meta and Amazon and yeah, all going towards Trump controlling the media, trying to control the judiciary, get things changed, ignore this, do that. That could be a route for Trump to stay in, even if he's unpopular with many. That's what Fidesz has done. That's what Orban has done. And he's grifted and corruptly engorged himself on the monies in Hungary in the same way that we see, I think, Trump and his family doing in the United States. So these are peas from the same pod here. But this Visegrad 4, Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia and Poland, I'd be interested to see if the next election Fico goes. Orban is now 15 points down, but on the other hand, Czechia is looking like it's going to get Babis in on a right-wing populist ticket that might go into coalition with the far right, and that will not be good for Ukraine. Poland is on a knife edge, really, because you've got kind of 50-50 liberal conservative there, where the Conservatives really are the PIS, who are a populist right-wing party. They're not like anti-Ukraine because Poland's a bit funky compared to other places, but they are populist, very populist, and they are trying to control, they were going to control the media and the judiciary. Europe is on a knife edge in many places, but I do wonder about populist regimes coming in and then people realizing that they're not very good and then that's the end of them, unless they can manipulate, rig the elections or rig the information spaces in ways that perpetuate their rule. Okay, we've then got Hungarian diplomat Mihaly András Becker, who served Orban's government in Romania until recently, tore up his Fidesz party membership card on camera, breaking with the regime in a symbolic move. He said Orban's support for Romania's far-right leader, George Simeon, was the last straw. This is just this big fight the whole time at the moment between the far right and everyone else. Moldova cuts off the Russian Hydra's head. So again, it's the same story here. Like, it's not just me banging on about the far right and being anti-right. This is genuinely the existential fight in Europe at the moment, and I would say in many other places like the United States. Moldova cuts off the Russia's Hydra's head. So Russia is supporting the far right or the far left when it's useful for them to do so, but the far left isn't so prevalent. Moldova's Central Election Commission has barred the pro-Russian bloc Victory from participating in the upcoming elections. This bloc is led by fugitive oligarch and fraudster Ilan Shor, who lives in Russia and has been trying to manipulate his way to power to bring the Russian world to Moldova. The commission cited multiple violations of election laws, including undeclared campaign expenses, such as trips by bloc members to Moscow. So interesting that we got that going on. And then, of course, Georgia Dream, the pro-Russian now political party that is ruling in Georgia, is still there. And here's an example of where they rigged things to stay in power. So there was enough to dislodge them. And in fact, there are people calling on the election to be rerun because it was rigged, and they rigged it so they won. For the 233rd consecutive day, Rustaveli Avenue is blocked. Protests continue in 8+ cities. The illegitimate, repressive Georgia Dream regime must collapse. Keep an eye out for us at a big rally tomorrow. This is a few days back, and then that rally took place the next day in Tbilisi. 4th day of daily nationwide protest. We're chanting until the end, meaning until the repressive, illegitimate, pro-Russian Georgia Dream campaign ends. So really good to see that Georgians are still standing up for democracy. Interesting to see American flags there. And, you know, in Congress, they did pass a bill recently that did support Georgia. So, you know, let's hope Congress can wrest power back from the executive and be a bit normal again. Russian propagandists have accused Azerbaijan of assisting Ukraine in preparing Operation Spiderweb, seemingly to justify Russia's failure to protect its strategic aviation and ongoing repression of Azerbaijani citizens inside the country. So as I said the other day, started off with, I don't know if it 100% started off, but the big flashpoint was when the Azeri Airlines plane, the Azal plane was shot down over Grozny, an Azerbaijani plane, by Russian air defense. We now know that it was Russian air defense that did that. There was a Russian commander's letter and an audio leak that confirmed that it was Russians what did it, rather like MH17. That happened. The Azerbaijanis were obviously incensed. They haven't had a suitable response from the Russians. The Russians haven't apologized or anything. And then you started seeing a tit for tat going on with where Russians were rounding out some top Azerbaijani diaspora community leaders in Russia. And then the Azerbaijanis arrested a couple of FSB agents who were operating in the Sputnik propaganda TV station in Baku in Azerbaijan. And then you've had this tit for tat going on between the two, and they do not like each other at the moment. This is good for Ukraine. It's bad for Russia. They are losing, I think, influence around that region. Azerbaijan arrests Wagner mercenaries. So Azerbaijan arrested its own citizens who joined Wagner after being prosecuted and imprisoned in Russia. They have been charged with waging terrorist warfare inside Ukraine. President Aliyev earlier this month refused to meet a high-ranking Russian delegation and sent them home. Azerbaijan has clearly decided that it no longer wants any Russian influence in the region, says the analyst. Turkey, Armenia and Azerbaijan have agreed a major transport link to Baku, and in turn are working with the Stan states to pipe oil and gas, and as well as Trans-Caspian sea routes. So together, you know, Azerbaijan appear to be getting together with their mortal enemies, Armenia, together with Turkey, who are kind of mortal enemies of Armenia due to the Armenian genocide. You know, you've got these three unlikely bedfellows getting together to do deals on transporting hydrocarbons, not through Russia, Like, Russia is going to lose out big time if that happens, and then Europe can get oil from Kazakhstan or wherever rather than from Russia, and that's why the Syria situation is really important, because you might get a pipeline through there, so on and so forth. This is super, super important. And then you've had a number of other moves in Azerbaijan to eschew that Russian influence. This is big. Azerbaijan, a former Soviet republic, has declared Crimea and other occupied territories as Ukrainian. Russia's imperial dreams are cracking. Look who's already resisting. And then Sean Pinner lists all these former Soviet nations who are not big fans of Russia these days. Well, never agree to occupation, never surrender, was the message Azerbaijani President Aliyev addressed to the Ukrainian people. It was also announced that Azerbaijan is preparing documents to appeal to international judicial bodies against Russia regarding the downing of that Azov passenger aircraft. The neighbours are sick of Russia, says Jay in Kyiv, along with announcing a lawsuit against Russia for shooting down the Azeri commercial airline on Christmas Day. The president advised the Ukrainians to never agree to occupation. Never agree to occupation. This is the main advice. This is what we did. So, as Jay in Kyiv says, it's always easier to keep the Russians out rather than to get them out once they are in. And then we hear that Kyrgyzstan is stopping Russian financial flows after US sanctions. So this is quite probably, I assume these are the Biden sanctions put in place, but have taken a long time to kind of filter through. Kyrgyz banks have begun to strictly limit settlements with Russian companies. This was reported by RBC, citing lawyers, consultants, and participants in foreign economic activity. According to them, the deterioration in the terms of settlements with Russia began at the end of last year. And then the problems have sharply worsened in recent months. Payment processing times have increased, fees have increased, and in some cases, transfers have stopped. According to data for last year, Russia accounted for 93% of all cross-border transfers to Kyrgyzstan, $2.8 billion, and 83% of funds withdrawn from the country, $370 million. There are a few things Prune wants to point out here, the source that's discussing this. We previously saw reports suggesting an agreement to just stop talking about the problems with cross-border transactions. I just don't know how much I'm going to go into this. Okay, 2, we have seen reports of issues with cross-border transactions as a result of things that Russia has been doing. And there are loads of references here, and Russians in general are having banking problems as a result of things that Russia is doing that aren't necessarily sanction related. Prune said, I did see a report recently from Russian sources suggesting that cross-border transactions had improved due to relaxation of US sanctions enforcement. And that's something that's surprising when I saw the headlines here, is that the US isn't doing a particularly good job of enforcing those sanctions, so that they are having an effect now is quite interesting. Note, this is something Russia said, and I have not actually seen their overall financial situation improve. We don't know if it's true. Countering the above claims that things improved is the claim that things have actually gotten much worse more recently in Kyrgyzstan specifically. That was stated in this article. Kyrgyzstan has also been blocking schemes used by Russians to get passports, closing a previous loophole, and there have also been more notable political conflict between Russia and Kyrgyzstan that could be attributed to many things. Ultimately, they may well be all tied back to Russia's weakening position to control countries they feel belong to them, while these countries see an opportunity to break free, so on and so forth. So again, Kyrgyzstan, you could add that to maybe Azerbaijan and Armenia. You've got Kazakhstan also, a little bit sort of wobbly at the edges too. So interesting times in this neck of the woods. Now, China has threatened the EU with retaliation over the sanctions that the EU has put on its banks and companies in kind of secondary sanctions and whatnot. Beijing has sharply reacted to the EU's 18th latest sanctions package, which for the first time targets Chinese entities. 2 regional banks were sanctioned, He Rural Commercial Bank and Heilongjiang Sufenei Rural Commercial Bank, along with 5 Chinese companies accused of helping Russia via cryptocurrency channels. China's Ministry of Commerce called the sanctions a, quote, serious blow to economic, trade and financial ties, and announced that Beijing would take retaliatory steps to protect the legitimate rights and interests of its companies. Meanwhile, the US is already hinting at the possibility of harsher measures against China. And of course, if Trump comes true on his words of the 50-day threat, then China is in the crosshairs of US secondary sanctions. Let's go to the US then. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, we don't know what the deadline will be, whether it's 10, 30 or 50 days, but any country that buys sanctioned Russian oil is going to be subject to the up to 100% secondary tariffs. The US Senate agrees with President Trump that tariffs are means to political ends. This is revolutionary. President Trump has changed the conversation here, and I would urge our European allies who have talked a big game to follow us if we implement these secondary tariffs, said percent. So he's like calling on Europe to, come on guys, you need to follow us when we put these sanctions on. And Europe's like, hang on, what are you doing lecturing us? We put 18 rounds of sanctions on, and you've been sitting there with your thumb up your ass. So Scott Bessant saying some somewhat controversial things there. A few people haven't been too happy with the way he was sounding there. I don't know if I've got reference to that. No. Right. Elliot Higgins talking here about how the US House has passed a Trump plan to cut $9 billion from foreign aid. So you've got USAID funding that has been absolutely slashed, but also public broadcasting. So not only the Voice of America, not only Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Asia, but NPR, PBS. It's just slash. Absolute gutting of American soft power, both domestically, I think, and also abroad. It's just, bad time to be doing stuff like that. And at the same time, Tulsi Gabbard, and I think this is an attempt to distract from Jeffrey Epstein, has then started digging out all the Russia hoax, scare quotes hoax. Of course, it's not a hoax. If you read the Mueller report, where it's very difficult to prove collusion, and I don't think the report was set out to look at collusion per se, but that's what it seemed to come to say. And Trump claimed it exonerated him, and it didn't. And Mueller has been asked about this very directly. He said no. The report clearly showed that there was big Russian influence in the 2016 American election, and there continues to be really that influence in American elections. So Tulsi Gabbard, under pressure because Trump is under pressure big time with the Epstein scandal, has now brought out, so they've released the Martin Luther King files, and they've released the JFK files, I think, or they certainly released the Martin Luther King against the desires of the Martin Luther King's family. They've released that to try and distract away from Epstein. They're also, well, we'll come on to that in a second. Tulsi Gabbard then said Americans will finally learn the truth about 2016. Intelligence was politicized and weaponized by the most powerful people in the Obama administration to lay the groundwork for what was essentially a years-long coup against President Trump, subverting the will of the American people and undermining our democratic republic. Here's how, and she releases this infographic of how this Russia hoax came from Obama, and she's essentially implicating Obama and calling for his arrest type thing. And this is just a massive distraction, also highly controversial. For months preceding the 2016 election, the intelligence community shared a consensus view Russia lacked the intent and capability to hack US elections, but weeks after President Trump's historic 2016 victory defeating Hillary Clinton, everything changed. And then, some so on and so forth. So she goes to town on doing this, produces a massive thread to distract people away from Epstein and onto what she calls the Russia hoax. Jim Himes, a senator, says, or is he a representative? He's a congressman, he's a representative from Connecticut, says this is utter nonsense, completely odd that then CIA Director Pompeo didn't say any of this, or that none of the 6 directors of national intelligence in Trump's first term said any of it. Once again, Tulsi Gabbard is trashing her own people in an attempt to regain Trump's favour or to distract from the Epstein scandal, probably both. So she's going to town on this, and it is highly controversial, and it is not cool. And it's, being treated with some disdain by many. So here Brennan says, a bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee investigation found that the US Intelligence Committee's assessment of Russian interference in the 2016 election was correct. Tulsi Gabbard has said she is referring for prosecution former American officials because they assessed Russia had tried to influence the election. Is there any legal basis? To which Representative Himes again says none, absolutely none. What you saw from the DNI was not just a lie about a very dangerous lie. The Senate, well, not just a lie, but a very dangerous lie. The Senate committee, then led by Marco Rubio, who's now the Secretary of State, right, found unanimously that Russia meddled in the election to try to assist Donald Trump. What Tulsi Gabbard is doing is a sleight of hand. Absolutely, this is really not cool. And here we have her with Maria Bartiromo, just trying to manufacture a false narrative to politicize the report. Brian Krasenstein says maybe Tulsi Gabbard should be the one that gets arrested. The most ironic thing is that Tulsi Gabbard is doing the exact thing that she's claiming Obama did, even though he didn't, which she claims is treason. Anyway, I'm not going to platform her nonsense on Fox News, but yeah, so I find that really, really counterproductive, because again, it's going to look to exonerate Russia as well from being the bad guys, and in the eyes of many Republicans on the MAGA side of things, that is going to allow them free rein to continue doing what they're doing in Ukraine, because hey, we shouldn't be so harsh against Russia. We were falsely harsh against them in 2016 and they never did anything wrong type thing, and that's absolutely not the case. The evidence is there. Tulsi Gabbard is compromised, end of. And Jeffrey Epstein, that whole thing needs to have a solution. We'll come to that in a second, because there is some important stuff to say. So a few other things. So we hear today that the US is pulling out of UNESCO. So UNESCO is the United Nations organization that promotes cooperation in education, science, culture, and communication to foster peace worldwide. So they're going to pull out of that. The idea is that from the Trump administration, it says it's got an anti-Israel bias, it's pro-China, it's got pro-China influence, woke agenda. The old woke stuff comes back again. UNESCO's now woke. A 90-day review found fault with the agency's DEI policies, so employing too many black people or something, I don't know, and its designation of Jewish heritage sites as Palestinian. Go and do some I don't want to talk about the archaeology of Syro-Palestinian heritage and whatnot. Anyway, so it could be a little bit more cynical, though, than the whole kind of we think UNESCO's too woke, so we're pulling out. Because, as H.I. Sutton says, so in the United States, will certain national parks no longer be protected by UNESCO status, mining and foresting opportunities? So while there is a big trade war with Canada and they need wood, let's just pull out of UNESCO and then we can chop down these lovely woods in the American wilderness. And we can whack a couple of massive open cast mines there. Mine, baby, mine. I don't know. Trump, I'm mentioning this because I did this in a big video the other day and just want to remind you that this is definitely happening. Trump is closing all 4 climate observatory stations in Alaska, Hawaii, American Samoa, and Antarctica because you can't have high CO2 levels if you don't measure CO2 levels. I talked about this previously. If you defund NOAA, NOAA, if you defund NOAA and the Weather Service, then you can't find out there's extreme weather coming, and so you can't look at all the data points that connect these extreme weather events to climate change. If we get rid of all the climate observatory stations, then if we're not observing it, then it's not happening. And at the same time, Trump's popularities are plummeting at the moment, and due to things like this, so even on immigration, he seems to be underwater because it's so... There are some people that be super pleased about this. You know, the stuff that Connor was espousing. You know, the sort of people like Connor earlier. Migrants, this is from a report, migrants at ICE jail in Miami were made to kneel and eat like dogs, a report alleges. The migrants at a Miami immigration jail were shackled with their hands tied behind their backs and made to kneel to eat food from styrofoam plates like dogs, according to Human Rights Watch report. Now, if that's actually happening, I mean, that's just horrific. Is that what people voted for? For immigrants to be rounded up, chained, and forced to kneel and eat from styrofoam plates like dogs? Is that the America that people want to see? Now, with all this happening and the Epstein stuff going a bit wrong for the Trump administration, Republicans in the House are reportedly considering adjourning Congress for 6 weeks. So they're going early, adjourning Congress for summer, so as, not to address inflation, not to handle border issues, but to avoid a vote on the Epstein files. According to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and reporting from Meredith Lee Hill, the House Rules Committee is unlikely to return at all this week, effectively halting legislative business. Why? Because pressure is mounting for a floor vote on the Epstein files, and the GOP leadership doesn't want it. So rather than being forced to vote on Epstein, just close down Congress and send them all home. Just incredible. And just going back to European things here, look at, I don't know what's going on here, but it does look like Vučić, the president of Serbia, has just signed a deal with Putin that he doesn't understand or didn't know what he was signing up for.
Opening a commercial office in Jerusalem this month and to move its embassy to Jerusalem in July. That's fantastic. That's a big thing. That's a very big statement, and we appreciate that very much. It's taken tremendous bravery by the president of Serbia and the president of Kosovo, who are with me today, two highly respected people, to embark.
It's an incredible bit of footage, this, and I love the fact he wants to put his head in his hands and then just last minute just push his hair across his forehead. Like, he has just signed up to moving his embassy, and he didn't realize that was in the documents. Moving his Israel embassy, just incredible.
Jerusalem this month and to move its embassy to Jerusalem in July. That's fantastic. That's a big thing. That's a very big statement, and we appreciate that very much. It's taken tremendous bravery by the president of Serbia and the president of Kosovo, who are with me today, two highly respected people, to embark on these talks and to come to...
It's just quite incredible. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there for good measure. And so just talking about the whole, so I'm going to finish this up with that, going back to the European unity. So you've got the US doing all sorts of things, attacking the EU, particularly when it's the EU rather than individual European nations. So he went to NATO summits and he went to, he's come back and said, look, these guys are really fighting for their nations and they want to do the best for themselves and Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. And he was all kind of amazed at that. But then his default position is the EU itself as a bloc is nasty. And what that has done in starting a trade war with the EU by whacking on 30% tariffs, it's actually bringing the EU together in greater unity in their disdain for Trump. Here, Timothy Milovanov talks about this, referring to a New York Times article. Trump's anti-EU pressure is uniting Europe. Public trust in the EU is near a 20-year high. Countries like Denmark now show 74% support, up from 63% in 2019. The bloc is signing new trade deals, increasing military spending and standing firm. According to the New York Times, in March, the EU launched a 150 billion euro joint procurement plan to boost defence. I'm hearing today that the UK is now possibly in on that. And we may be helping to fund that, as in we're not just having our companies do business, our defense companies do business by accepting tenders from nations that are accessing that funding, but actually we may be much more formally a part of it. Anyway, Germany and France have tightened cooperation since Merz's May victory. Even post-Brexit, UK wants in. Trump threatened 30% tariffs on EU goods. He called the bloc pathetic, accused it of screwing America and demanded more defense spending, or else the US won't step in. Instead of fracturing, the EU states closed ranks. Italy's far-right Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni backed Brussels. Europe has the financial strength to secure a fair agreement. Italy will do its part. Her stance shocked Trump's team, who expected an Italy first shift. The EU is negotiating trade deals with Mexico, South Korea and Indonesia. Indonesian President Prabowo said, I admit openly we want to see a stronger Europe. Even skeptical leaders now see the bloc as essential to global stability. Ursula von der Leyen says the EU must shape a new world order, one without bros or oligarchs making the rules. Hurrah! The message to Trump and Putin is clear. Europe isn't backing down, it's uniting. The message to Trump and Putin being put together there by European leaders for their desires to see the EU undermined. Fascinating stuff. Hopefully, like, what I'm doing is just drawing all these threads together to give you an understanding of what's going on. Yes, I concentrate a lot on America, probably too much, but hey ho, that's what I do. But this game of chess that's going on in the world, it's important to know how it's all working, both, with these players interacting with each other, but also what's going on in individual countries domestically, in terms of the rise of the populist right and immigration and issues like that. So yeah, anyway, it is what it is. Thank you very much for watching. It's been a huge one, but I'm doing fewer videos, but a couple of longer ones today. So take care. Speak soon.